So I think we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inward Lens, Workman Arts Photography Workshop inspired by Matthew Wong. My name is Melissa Smith, and I'm the Assistant Curator of Access and Learning in our Education Programming Division at the AGO. And we're just going to, so this is the AGO, which we're kind of engaging with virtually. But we're going to start with a land acknowledgement. So although we are gathering in a digital realm, I would like to acknowledge that the AGO is on the lands that are the traditional homes of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. Takaranto continues to be home to many Indigenous people who live alongside settlers, newcomers, and people whose ancestors were enslaved across the Americas and the Caribbean. As a first-generation settler whose family comes from England, I'm incredibly grateful to live and work on this land. Recognizing this in a meaningful way means acknowledging our colonial past and making commitments to sharing and upholding responsibilities to our ancestors and all who now live on these lands and the land itself. In our work, let us be mindful of our commitments to the land and our communities while considering the 7 generations who came before and the 7 generations to come. So Workman Arts and the AGO have partnered to offer this live online art making workshop focused on creative making as a form of well-being, inspired by Matthew Wong's Blue View exhibition, which is currently on at the AGO and will be up until May 15th. Esmond Lee, our facilitator today, will lead us through a photography workshop considering personal narratives, emotional narratives, and visual narratives, and contemplating quiet everyday objects and spaces. Esmond is an artist, researcher, and practicing architect based in Toronto's suburbs. He explores long-term intergenerational experiences of migration in peripheral spaces, and he has created public installations that include a continuous 250-foot vinyl mesh installation for Nuit Blanche Toronto and a 30-foot tall installation at Malvern Town Centre for Contact Photography Festival. So without further ado, Esmond, we're excited to be with you this evening.
Thanks, Melissa, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Esmond. I go by he, him, and I'd like to first thank everyone for joining me today on a Friday evening. My work is primarily lens-based, working with cameras, but I also work in installation, as mentioned, which intersects with my background in architecture. I'm interested in how our identities and values are reflected in the objects and spaces all around us, and you'll see that later when I show a little bit of my work. So let me start sharing my screen. So I'm really excited to be here to talk about photography as inward lens, inspired by the amazing paintings of Matthew Wong, and also drawing similarities to my own work. As a quick question, has everyone here seen the exhibition? If you haven't, it's okay. I just want to get a sense. Sorry, my chat disappeared too. Oh, yes. Okay, great. Just want to say that feel free to jump in with any questions or thoughts anytime in the chat. I'll try to monitor the chat, but I'm going to rely on Natalie and Melissa to help keep an eye out, and feel free to interrupt me anytime you want just to bring something to my attention. So the workshop today will be broken out into kind of 4 main sections: the brief history of photography. And when I say brief, I really mean brief. And it's really to touch on the idea of this outward lens in contrast to the inward lens that I'm going to talk about today. Of course, Matthew Wong's paintings, my photographs, and this idea of visual journaling. But before I explore the idea of the inward lens, I want to give a brief, like I said, overview of photography and what that means in terms of the outward lens. Who here has used maybe a film camera before, old enough to use something even old and bulky like this in the photo? No one. Anybody? Yeah. So back in the day when it all started, so photography was very specialized. Cameras were large like this, required specialized knowledge from very specialized people to operate. Various plates, papers, chemical processing, facilities, darkrooms that aren't available every day. So in this way, those who had access and operated the camera held the power. The subject was at the mercy of the photographer. But slowly, the camera became much more affordable and much more widespread. Technology, industrial improvements allowed everyday people to own compact cameras and use it as part of their everyday life. Family albums became prevalent. This trajectory is similar to the personal computer, how a computer began as a very specialized tool and eventually it became part of our everyday life, like we're experiencing right now. And I'm old enough to have used a compact point and shoot camera, a film camera. I remember carrying dozens rolls of film for trips, bringing them all to a film lab after for processing, having to wait a few days, a week to finally see developed shots. So it was quite the experience and quite the process, even though it was very accessible at the time. Many of us have become visual authors in our own right. Because of the technology, because of their access, we all have something to capture, something to remember, and something to say. But still, photography was really about capturing someone or something else, whether it's another person, event, or a landscape. Photography is always an outward act. The subject isn't the one looking through the lens and does not know exactly how that portrayal would turn out. Again, it's at the mercy of the photographer. And so photography has already remained this tool of the external, a relationship between author and subject. But naturally, we want to be the authors of our own story and narrative. We want to capture ourselves on our own terms. Although selfies is a very modern kind of terminology, it's not exclusive to our current times. People have been making self-portraits in photography and paintings for decades and even centuries. The one on the left here is one of my absolute favorite, self-portraits. It's over 100-year-old, but still feels absolutely timeless because both of the clarity of the photo, but also, it's a very timeless moment that we can all relate to. It's a loving couple who wanted to capture a memory of themselves together. And it's a photo I can look at really forever and just makes me smile and feel joy and love all the time. And thanks to this reduction in barrier in owning cameras, like I said, we all have the ability to make these photos. We can all take these selfies and we're in control of making these photographs and sharing them with another our loved ones or family. But for me, this idea of a self-portrait doesn't really go far enough. It's not deep enough. And in the work I do as well, I want to take this further. And it brings me to the question is, are we simply how we look? Is our body always representative of who we are? And for me, this isn't often the case. My other self, my inner self, my outer self may not express the complexity that's inside me, whether it's feelings of turmoil, sadness, or joy or elation. And so me, it's often the inner world that I experience, my heart and mind, that I think is the most reflective of me and something that I think deserve to be captured and reflected in some ways. And so I'm interested in exploring this inner world, like I said, and I like to think of this great quote by Dumbledore for some wisdom. And I'll read, "Of course it is happening inside your head, Harry, but why on earth should that mean that it is not real?" I'm not a Harry Potter expert or anything like that, but I just remember this quote and it always jumps out at me when I think about looking at great works of Matthew Wong's painting and just thinking about objects and spaces all around us and in relation to our inner self, that the things we feel and think are absolutely real, despite not maybe being visualized or easily represented. So that brings me back to the kind of exploration of Matthew's painting now. Like I said, I'm interested in exploring this personal thoughts and feelings, this emotional self-portrait, emotional selfie, or the way I call it, just the inward lens. How are we exploring the inward self through something that's inherently an outward practice with a camera? And I think we can learn how to do this by looking at some of Matthew's paintings and the techniques that he used. And for those that haven't seen this exhibition, Blue View, it's a collection of paintings of nocturnal feeling of still life, interiors and landscapes expressed through strong use of monochromatic blue colors. So at first glance, these paintings appear to be just about the outer world. It's a flower, a table, a window, a forest. But if we really examine these closely, we begin to see that they are actually looking at Matthew. We see him, we see his contemplation, his feelings through the viewing of these objects and spaces that he's depicted. We get a rich sense of intimacy and mood in his paintings. But how has he done this for us? His paintings has a strong sense of three main features that I think makes these great paintings that we can take and translate into some of our own practices: perspective, framing, and lighting. The flower in this vase is something that would otherwise be very small in reality, is presented at the forefront, filling the entire canvas almost. The flower is presented almost like a portraiture, the way you would paint or photograph a person sitting in a chair or just someone you want to capture. This flower is situated in a dark room. It's impossibly illuminated with light from the windows cast from behind, creating a shadow towards the viewer. But somehow the flower is glowing, providing its own light almost, as you get a sense of this being more alive than anything else in the space. At the same time, the outside is bright and vibrant with details, but inside the room where the viewer sits is dark and vague. We only know that this is a room from seeing a glimpse of a door on the left and the top of a chair on the right. This feeling of being situated in a dark, quiet room against a bright exterior really creates a strong sense of contemplation, of safety. And it's as if this house represents to me the body, and this bright flower is actually the person, the thoughts and feelings. The highlight on the glass also has this kind of sparkle. The water also has a sparkle and a magical feeling with a slight tinge of green to make us feel that it's really much alive, and it contrasts really well with the dark blue room that's around it. And this is actually one of my favorite paintings of Matthew's. I want to share another quote for us to consider while we look at Matthew's work. A repainted image of something is also about the absence of the real thing. All paintings is about the presence of absence. So I think a lot about John Berger's words, and it's true so when looking at Matthew's work. I think there's a lot of relevance. John Berger is an art critic, writer, poet. He's well known for his influential book titled Ways of Seeing. I really recommend this book as a side thing. It's also available as a 4-part video series made in 1972. It's really available on YouTube. You just do a simple search, but I'll be quoting John a lot through this workshop. So something to keep in mind, kind of your own takeaway homework. So, although this quote doesn't directly, speak at Matthew's work, I think it provides just a lot of insight to thinking about his paintings of everyday objects, what is absent in his paintings, and what becomes present because of the absence in his paintings. Here's another painting of similar style. Again, these elements are very basic. At the end of the day, a flower, a vase, blinds, stars, and moon beyond. But the way of layering them together, the specific framing, the lighting, the relationship between outside and inside, they all come together to provide a space for contemplation. I would say this painting is actually a window into Matthew's brooding self, his state of mind. In fact, if we actually look carefully at the vase, we see a figure of a person drawn on the flower vase. So I'm always wondering, is Matthew representing himself on the flower? What does this symbolize? There's so much presence in this painting, despite being most of it being absent and in a way blank. His paintings always depict having a light source also far away from the viewer and casting back at us. This source of light and the exterior, the idea of the exterior is always elusive to the viewer. We know where exactly we are in a room, but never quite what's on the other side of the exterior. He uses the lighting and perspective to really keep the viewer within ourselves, within our own quiet space. The room within is both foreground and background. The foreground is like painted in a very dark monochromatic blue, while the brightness is in the background, which is not the way you typically would imagine photographing or painting something. You would always want the light to be the foreground of the object. But this technique of kind of like pushing the intrigue behind it really creates a sense of, again, the theme is peace, security, safety by looking at his photographs or paintings. It really gives us a sense of contemplation that's very powerful. So I just want to take a moment and look at this painting together. And based on the things we've discussed, or I've mentioned, does anyone have any thoughts or interpretations of what they see here? How does it make you think or feel? Mosquito netting. Interesting.
The blue is just so calming. I think that's what overwhelms me, and particularly what's so lovely about the exhibition too. So it like calms you and then almost draws you in to look at details.
Mm-hmm. So when Elizabeth said relax and a sense of serenity because of the pale blue coloring. Yeah, absolutely. Right. The quiet time just before going to sleep. And I think that also provides a really great sense of comfort and peace, a sense of security. I think that's the theme, is that there's so much security in looking at his photos or paintings, sorry. Light through the darkness, dream. Yeah. Yeah. For me, I'd also start to think about, and I'll try to get into the space, think about who is this bed for, who sleeps here. The bed is intentionally cut off, so I can't really see the sense of the space, but there's that odd pair of glasses that's on the floor on the left, and it's a very distinctly designed pair of glasses. So it really gives us a sense that someone is actually here, and this is a occupied space. And the most distinct part is the glasses. Untitled. Yeah, it has very dreamlike quality as well, that someone mentioned. It also really makes me intrigued when I look outside the window, and the most detail other than the glasses is the building on the other side, but it's still vague enough that you don't know where you are. You just know that you're somewhat elevated. It's a highly populated city because, this is what it looks like, an apartment on the other side or an office, but you're in a very quiet, safe space in a dark evening in a sleeping city. So really enhances that feeling of solitude, of peace, and really invites contemplation, I think. And the light source here is actually I interpret it as from the lamp above, and what is seen as mosquito net is actually like the light casting on the glasses and the bed. It's very alluring, very provocative, and it really, like, the theme of all this is really makes me think about my own thoughts when I look at this, because it allows that comfort.
It also looks like a cathedral or
Yeah.
a sacred space. And
Right.
the light is shining in the foreground. With other pictures, the lights are always in the distance.
Yeah.
This is actually, the immediacy is in the foreground.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. Great. So we're going to move on to some of his exterior paintings, which at first glance you'll think like, oh, they're exterior, they don't give the same impression, but to me, they actually absolutely give the same intrigue, but at the same time, a little bit more relief and peace than some of his interior paintings. We can see that there's a house on the left, but it's not clear about the people. There's only a mere shadow. There's another house that's behind it that seems like it's blocked or obscured. We see what looks like a barn on the right, and then a hint of an animal, but you can't really tell because the head is hidden behind the structure. So Matthew does a great job in creating these really dark, what could be easily read as abandoned or like dystopic scenes, but he gives enough light and color and figures just enough to bring the liveliness right back. So they're definitely not desolate paintings or desolate spaces. They're very much calming places. And we get the hint of the sun coming from afar in the blue sky that really brings us this idea of joy and peace. Looks like someone's getting changed in the bottom left window. Yeah. Yeah. To me, I also see it, I think it was like a baseball cap person's wearing, but it's up for interpretation, which is very fun. Of the amount of detail in the paintings and the blue colors. Yeah. Yeah. The blue, I think, is really what gives you that sense of nocturnalness, of night, the peace when everyone else is asleep and you're the only one that's awake. The only one thinking and in thought here. Definitely provides a very mysterious feeling. I love that in some of these landscapes that introduce the body of water too. And you can even see on the left what looks like the land. There's a hint of light. Maybe there's another town or a city from afar. That's the kind of the lights coming from these distant buildings. So really feels great when, imagine yourselves in this scene when everyone else is more or less asleep. Here's another quote I just want to share. I'm sorry for throwing all these quotes, but I think these are just great ways of kind of accessing some of the techniques and thoughts that Matthew might be thinking when we're looking at his paintings. The relationship between what we see and what we know is never settled. Each evening we see the sunset, we know that the earth is turning away from it, yet the knowledge, the explanation never quite fits the sight. So really, to me, in other words, is we have seen plenty of sunsets in our lives. We know exactly what to expect, how a sun works. There's no mystery. But each time we look at a sunset, it evokes a great sense that is beyond the obviousness of the sunset. we can begin to explore these questions, these desires and doubts onto the things that we see around us. And this applies to the everyday objects around us. So let's look at this painting together again. Let me know your thoughts, your feelings, your immediate reaction when you see this painting, and I'll share some of mine after. Anybody? Oh. Right, the contrast between the cool and the warm of the image during the sunset, absolutely. Tornado, interesting. Yeah, I definitely see the road. Dense forest and still waters. Yep. Yeah, when I look at this, I mean, obviously there is a forest, there is a sun, and it looks like a body of water, and the road leading. But when I look at this, I actually see a path, a journey. Maybe it's leaving, maybe it's arrival. It's not clear, but it's really about this feeling of leaving or arriving to a place that's outside this darker forest. So, you know, it's arriving to a sense of joy, of rest, of freedom. So when I look at this painting, I first see the literal things around me, but then it all disappears, and I just get that emotional feeling of that, and it's quite nice. This piece is called A Dream. Yeah, and the way he's painted the road leading to this, it looks like maybe even a sandy beach in the foreground. Yeah, it really gives you a great sense of a journey in this piece. The yellow brick road. The Wizard of Oz. Yeah, the journey, absolutely. And that's the beautiful thing. Like, obviously, I see this as a journey for myself because maybe these are the things I'm thinking about constantly in my life. But looking at his paintings really helps evoke these kind of thoughts of my own. So I'm going to go to the last one right here of his paintings. It's a very quiet, nondescript sleeping town is being depicted. It's under a sparkly sky reflected in water. The sky is dancing in the sea of stars, which is really, really amazing. I think it's really interesting. He's depicted this in our views from atop of this sleepy town, almost in line with the mountains from afar. This perspective really gives us a sense of being like on top in the center of the world. Even though it's dark and gloomy, we feel a sense of warmth and life from not only the sparkling stars, but also some of the smoke in the background, which I interpret as maybe chimneys of other houses keeping warm overnight. It's a great balance of expressing darkness and quietness, yet not being devoid of life. And I think this is a very amazing, masterful way of kind of balancing this thing and creating that warmth and joy in darkness. And like all his paintings, it just transports us to kind of feeling of contemplation of deep thoughts and journeys, at least for me, very much so. So I hope looking at, Matthew's painting really gives us a sense of the things, the techniques he used, the perspectives, the lighting, the color, and the framing of very simple everyday objects in communicating all these feelings and senses. So I'm going to start sharing some of my own photography project and use this as an example of how each of us can explore our own inner world and the idea of inner lens through the photography process. We'll go through some simple exercises and prompts, but yeah, I'm going to first talk about this project. As mentioned, I explore long-term and intergenerational experience of migration in my artistic practice. This began with the very first project titled Between Us, where I turned my passion for photography into a process of experiencing turmoil and uncertainty as a way of healing and processing. The suburban house has been a cornerstone of this North American dream or myth. Having a home, something to call your own, is a dream that's especially important for many immigrant parents like myself, or my own, coming to a new foreign land. It's a place of security, a place to exercise your agency when the outside world can often feel so hostile and insecure. Like many working class parents, mine sacrificed so that I could achieve higher education and have a better life than they had. And so not wanting to deprive their dream, I gave a part of mine by buying a house together for us to share in this quiet Scarborough suburbs. And so this house basically represents the modest socioeconomic achievement of two generations of hardships, of sacrifices. It symbolizes success in the face of great challenges of our family's migration journey. But this house wasn't everything that it promised. We found that living together revealed the great distance my parents had between us. My dad and I are separated by, almost 50 years of cultural, generational, and temporal space. We are raised in different worldviews and expectations. We live under the same roof, but could not be further apart. I was unhappy, got between my own personal goals and aspirations and the desire of honoring my parents. So the house became the source of despair, and I often looked outside for happiness. So part of processing these feelings of confusion, of sorrow, and love, I began to photograph the objects and spaces around me to capture some of these thoughts and feelings. It was a process that was very therapeutic. Being able to kind of project my emotions onto the things around me, and in a way storing them onto these photographs was a very important process that I went through. And at the same time, it also allows me to share some of the things I was experiencing that I often didn't have words for, while also maintaining kind of my own privacy and my family's privacy. So it did a lot of things for me to photograph kind of these emotions and these situations. So I used the objects and spaces to kind of stand in place for my parents and I. I created portraits of our family through the everyday objects around us. I wanted to speak about the distance between us, the fragility of both love and sorrow through these objects, while keeping us anonymous to the outside world. And it also speaks about how I feel and how I was thinking about the house around me. This house was supposed to be a celebration, but it became something that was very different. And so in this way, I've invited viewers through both a visual diary of my family story and also a view of our shared home. The light coming from the window, the two pair of slippers signifying their owners. These objects are the way I want you to understand us through. I would like to think that, some of these images are more telling of how I feel, of who I am and what I'm going through, more than what a portrait of me or my parents could ever say. And here's another quote I'd like to share with everyone to contemplate for a little bit. We never look at just one thing. We're always looking at the relationship between things and ourselves. Anyone have any thoughts about this quote? I know it's a very deep one. It takes I've thought about these words for so long, so I definitely don't expect great interpretation, but it's just something to keep in mind while we look through some more photographs and think about how we think about the objects around us and how we might photograph them to kind of explore our own inner world. So these photographs were created between 2014 and 2016 using a very basic point and shoot camera with basically no photo editing. And I think that's something that we all can do in our own lives. Is we all have access to a basic point and shoot, maybe a smartphone camera or even an old film camera, but we all have the tools. And this is basically how I started my artistic practice, is through this one project of 2 years. I was photographing the things I was experiencing, feeling, and looking at the objects around us. I don't move or stage anything, using only natural and found light sources. Every moment is found. And again, going back to Matthew's paintings, I also use very similarly three very important techniques that I mentioned: framing, perspective, and lighting. These photographs are not about the object or spaces necessarily, again, but it's about the absent and what's represented in the absence. That's what the inner lens is about, is these objects, these gestures are being captured, representing someone. There's someone behind all this. Someone has created this current place, this what it looks like to be a cloth there. These gestures are everyday practices that we kind of mark around us that are subtle, but very telling about the people around. Like in this case, who put this fabric here? What is it for? Is it the cover of this event? Is it to remove it? Is it a mistake? But does that really matter? It's also about the emotions that we get evoked through looking at this vagueness and this mysteriousness of these photos. And I've lived in this house for over a decade now, so nothing here is really the same. A house or a space might appear static and quiet, but it is very much alive with thoughts and emotions that's reflected about the inhabitants. So in our everyday practice of photography or photographing, we're trying to find these kind of little subtle gestures that reflect the things that are about us and who we are. So I'd like to take a moment just to ask a few basic questions. Feel free to put in the chat or answer on video or voice. But what are some of the everyday objects or spaces that you enjoy looking at or even photographing if you're already doing that? Natural world, flowers, trees, animals, bones, and stones. Great. Is there, what draws you to flowers, trees, animals, bones, and stones? Who grew up on the land and off the grid? Great. Yeah, I think you just mentioned how these objects and natural environment really reflects who you are because this is somewhere you've grown up on. And I think that's very beautiful. And so you're re-engaging that part of your identity. Flower. My image library on my phone is mainly my pooch. Flowers, old toys, found items. Interesting. What about old toys that draws you into them? I take a lot of photos of my chinchilla and also self-portraits. I personally don't take any photos of myself. I think the work that I've done, I think speaks a lot about how I feel and who I am, and colors, nature, different shades of green. Interesting. Great. I feel like everyone's drawn to very different things. And I think that's great to think about how we relate to these objects and why we're drawn to these objects. Why do they speak to us and how they're illuminated? Objects when illuminated by light come alive. Changing season of my mother's keepsakes. That's really nice. Yeah, these are fantastic. I think these are the things that we can start to consider and think about in trying to photograph ourselves through these objects that we're really drawn to. So going back to kind of the techniques I was talking about, I want to introduce 3 very simple exercises, kind of takeaways that you can all do. Unfortunately, not here in this kind of context, but something to explore on your own. And the first one is, the big one is understanding light. So photographing a small object or place in different lighting and/or time of day. During sunrise, afternoon, sunset, moonlight, cloudy day, sunny day. It could be fluorescent light or incandescent light. I think that's really important to realize that our environment is very shaped by light in very dramatic ways that we might not think of. For example, you can revisit a very personally important space or a space that draws you in and go back during a sunrise, go back in moonlight, go back in the morning. The way the light hits it will cast a different shadow. The color of the light will be very different, and it will dramatically change and shape the way you think of the space. And I think that'll be a really great exercise to photograph these and to look at the different photographs and see how the space will, in different lighting, will draw you in differently. Maybe you don't like the way that looks in the morning. It doesn't, relate to you. It doesn't speak to you, but maybe it speaks to you in the way a sunset might for the space. Another way is to take an object and go around to different places, different lighting, and see how that object looks in a different way, in a different context. But it's all about discovering light, discovering it in different ways. That's instead of just setting up in a studio. I think there's something really fun about exploring and finding these things and the moments that relate to us. So when Elizabeth said, I enjoy looking at 2 orchids that are blooming right now like crazy. I also love and appreciate the cherry blossoms, as well as anything of movie star Marilyn Monroe. That's neat. So let's look at this photograph that I took of my own home together while I think about lighting. There's a strong presence of a person that is absent here. What do you think you see here? What are the things, what are the objects, what are the things that you can read about a person through this photograph? A shrine to the toilet paper shortage of early 2020. Oh yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
The chrysanthemum, and I don't know if it's a chrysanthemum or a peony on the curtains, but they kind of are, amplifying each other in a way, as well as the writing paper and.
Yeah, no, great observation on the currents. It's obvious the flower is an important symbol for this person. It's in the current, it's on the table, and there's a line that's purposely shining on the flower. Again, I didn't set this up, it's a found, but I think it really speaks to the joy and love for a flower, for flowers in general. And what does that speak to the person? What does the flower represent? So very, this is my mother's room. So I love the purplish blue curtains with flowers. Valued personal space. Absolutely. This is a quiet space of hers. And by me looking at it, it also gives me a sense of quietness, of beauty, of solitude to reflect on. I think that's what's so great about the actual space, and then the image that comes out of it. I see a desk that someone is working on with all their supplies present. Yep. Yeah, it's a very productive space too, with all the things happening on the desk. Absolutely. So going on to this kind of second photography exploration people can do and take away is understanding framing. So how to photograph an object or space in different framing, whether it's center framing, whether it's corner framing, or whether it's cut off. So we saw in Matthew Wong's painting, he positions different things at the corners and he'll sometimes center them, he'll sometimes cut them off, and he sometimes won't. And I think these are very important decisions in the way we tell or speak about the photograph and to express the meaning of that photograph. So I'm going to an example here. It's a photograph I've taken in my own basement. So can someone think about how the framing here is done and how the meaning of this photograph would change if this is maybe centered framing, corner framing, but right now it's in the kind of the top left framing? Anybody?
Well, to me, it feels like a bit like an escape. It's like an escape hatch or something. And then the reflection of the light on the ceiling too is what it looks like to me. I don't know if that's what I'm seeing, but it's kind of a little bit of a trompe l'oeil, but in a way it's almost like it's flipped up somehow, but I think it's just the light. I'm not sure.
You're right. You're right. No, that's a great read into it. So yeah, it speaks to my emotional feeling at the mind where I felt like I needed an escape from this house, and it's about looking up and to the left, almost like something that I maybe can't reach, but it's in view, in reach. Right. So yeah, exactly. That framing really gives you that presence, that sense. It would feel very different if I shot this maybe dead on in line with my eye level. It wouldn't feel the same way. Or maybe it's the lower right. No, that's a great read. Somewhat large
gives you an outlet, kind of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Like this is a very empty kind of white drywall room, but there's a beautiful curtain at the window. So it really speaks about, you're right. You got it right on. And so when it says large negative space on the right. Yep. So it kind of represents the darkness that I was feeling in this room, in this house, in this space. How does framing of the window change your interpretation of this photo? Okay. Right. So much shadow. I feel a sense of isolation, darkness. Yeah, no, that definitely spoke to some of the things I was feeling at the time, for sure. So we can begin to think about, how I've used photography techniques of framing, of lighting to speak to the things I wanted to say and the things I was going through. Obviously, if you want to speak to joy and happiness, and you can see that in some Matthew Wong painting, there's different ways of approaching that. If I shot this through the window, it would definitely be a photo of joy, of arrival, like the one we saw with the sunrise opening up into the water. This technique is employed in this way to communicate how I feel. So the third one, understanding perspective. So I think it's important or great to explore the idea of just an object or space from different angles, whether we put something in the foreground or background, we photograph from the side or front, and in relationship with different objects. When we put something in the foreground, there might be another object or space behind it that in relation will read differently. So, a great exercise just to take an object with you, or find a space that you like, an object in a space that you like, and just approach it from different angles, filling your frame differently and different lighting, and then just bring all the things that you kind of thought about in the first two exercises of lighting, of framing, and comparing all of that and see what you get from all these kind of different ways of shooting very simple everyday objects. I think it'll be really intriguing, the results you get from it. So here's an example of, I think, perspective that I've used here. Can anyone speak to or have any thoughts of the perspective in this photograph and what it says, or what you interpret it as? There's no wrong answer in the end of the day. Emptiness, no sense of personal effects, escape on a summer's day. Yeah. Yeah. What's great about this photograph is that it's vague and empty enough that it leaves a lot of room for interpretations. And I think that's the power of kind of everyday objects in space photography, where we don't look at the obvious, the literal, and the specific, but open it up to just forms, really. Yeah, it definitely feels like a summer's day. It's like you can see the sun coming through the window, the shadows being cast on the bed. So the way I chose to use perspective here is that it almost looks like I've shot this, and I've shot this laying in bed, and it gives the viewer the sense of being in the bed, as opposed to, we saw other paintings from Matthew where we're shooting on top of the bed, from the bed, but this is in the bed looking out into the window. Nothing's very clear and obvious. We don't see the full bed, we don't see the full window, but you really get a sense of being present in this space. And I think it's a very powerful way to kind of explore this idea for me of hope, of light, of just being comfortable in a bed. It's like the feeling of waking up and not having to get to your day first, and that kind of moment where you get for yourself to contemplate, to think your thoughts, or it may be the moment just before sunsets and I'm just getting ready to go to bed or relax in bed too. It's up to interpretation, but no matter what, it's that moment of rest and peace, of self-care, even strong sense of line. Yeah. And I think this is a good exercise too, for everyone, is think of like a comfortable space you're in, just a room that you like. It could be even your bedroom, a basement, anything you want, and keep a camera beside you. And when you first wake up, think about the things you're feeling or you're thinking before you have to get to your day, and photograph something in your room and see how that image looks and how that relates to the things you're thinking and feeling. So similar to the first question, but a little bit more specific, what is an everyday object or so that you feel connected to? Why do you feel connected to it? And does it represent who you are? So in this way, I'm thinking about the question about maybe a piece of belonging that's around you in your room, in your apartment, in your house, something that you feel connected to, or a space nearby, a place that's nearby. my phone, it's external brain memory. Yeah, I absolutely can't live with my phone either. It's my calendar. It's where I store my photographs that I take of everyday life. Yeah, absolutely. My notebook that I write in. Yeah, that would be very important and powerful too. So I would think about, as this very simple exercise, that notebook is such an important kind of object in your daily life. Think about how do you photograph that in a way that's very telling and revealing without, seeing the actual notes inside your notebook. Am I comfortable where I get the rest and recharge for the following day? Yeah, and we see how Matthew has, painted some of his comfortable spaces as he's seen around him and what that means to him and how that's reflected. So I also want to talk about a little bit of slight abstraction in photographing, and I think that's something really interesting too, because it further removes us from looking at the literal and just going into this sense of emotion. Can anyone tell how this is produced or what we're looking at exactly?
A bathtub.
Oh, everyone's very on top of it. It is a bathtub. Very wonderful. Good. Yeah. And so, we don't think of the corner of a bathtub as a very interesting thing to look at, but at this time of the day, the sun was setting and the curtains happens to be a textile fabric that has a pattern. So light was coming through it and it casted a very beautiful moment in the bathtub. And I looked at it, and for me, it provided a lot of emotional thought and feeling. And I just decided to photograph that moment. And so a lot of this photographing I do, and I think it's fun to do or interesting to do, is just a very intuitive way, just looking at shapes and shadows and objects around you and not worried about what it means or what you're looking at, but what do you feel instinctively? What hits you right away? And just capture that as a photo. And I think that would create some really interesting results for you to look at, to reflect on, and it speaks a lot. I photographed a chain yesterday. I will take a look at that. Very cool. And, these are the types of photographs I think at the end of the day, I'm trying to convey in how we can create these for ourselves. Think about the lighting, the framing, the perspectives, how to create depth, layering, and just go beyond what we're looking at and what's being depicted. I think these colors speak more than the house and the curtain that we're looking at in some of these photos that I'm trying to make. I think the biggest takeaway is also to be loose. There's no wrong or bad photograph. It's not about the perfect, expensive camera to make crisp, sharp images of a thing we want to clearly see. It's just to explore and to feel and to use that camera to kind of be the extension of that experience. Thank you. Yeah, this was use of great sunset lighting. Sunsets are my favorite. I'm a night person, so when the sun goes on, it's when I feel the most alive. And so that's when I engage the best, and they end up to be the better photographs because it's just something that I notice really clearly for myself. And I try to capture that around me. So pretty. The houses look like the same. The curtains and the lighting makes it feel unique and personal. Yeah. And so the one thing I like to do is to take what people might assume as everyday banal space and object of the suburbs. I mean, there's a lot of issues with the suburbs, but at the end of the day, try to think of these as beautiful places. And similar to how Matthew Wong paints, is the things that he depicted are very banal, very mundane, very everyday, but there's so much emotion and contemplation injected into these spaces. And I think that's what's so beautiful about that. And so then we can look around us in our everyday and not just take it for granted and then think that the things every day are boring or yeah. So on that idea of technique, I love Eric B. and Rakim, and I just wanted to use this as the motto, is to don't sweat the technique in photography. Use whatever tool you have. It could be a cheap smartphone, cheap whatever, but just make photos and have fun with them. Don't get caught up in kind of the nerdiness of technology and whatnot. It's about making photos, and we all have the capacity to author photos, and it's a great time to be in. Again, just wanted to end this part of my workshop with one final photograph and to reiterate the idea of So suburban house is seen as a very mundane, everyday thing. But, in my view, there's a lot of complexity, a lot of stories are happening in the suburbs. My family and my story isn't unique. There's a lot of rich sorrows, happiness, joys, conflict happening throughout the suburban landscape. And these are just my ways of revealing these kind of emotions in my work. And I'm sure everyone else here has kind of great stories and great things to show within the everyday spaces around them. So the last thing I wanted to talk about really quickly is the idea of the visual diary. So we have all these images, you've gone through and done the exercises, you've taken a bunch of images. What do we do together with them? So there's two ways of actually just going about a visual diary as an example, but you can adapt them however you want. Is to take one photograph every day for 7 days, 9 days, however you want, or you can take one photograph a week for several weeks. But the idea is just to think about this as, I said, a visual diary. You're photographing as if you're writing your diary in every other day, and make this an instinctive thing, and take whatever camera that's readily with you, either that's on your smartphone or it could be an old film camera that you're comfortable with. But just make this kind of a practice for yourself and kind of have a collection of photographs. And so when you have this collection, what do you do with it? So I'm going to show you different ways that I've dealt with a collection of photographs, collection of this series. One is just, you can look at it on your own browser folder loosely. In this case, here's an example of me. I have uploaded to a Flickr service where I can easily kind of rearrange photographs, look at them in a set, because I think that's very powerful to look at images together that you've done over, a month, several months, and see what has changed or what are the commonalities you've had, or what are the contrasts you found in the way you've taken your photographs. Like, be surprised by looking back at your photographs. And that's why I think the spontaneity of photographing would be really, really great without thinking too hard about, I'm going to depict in chronological order of my photographs. Like, you're not trying to show like a day in life. You're not trying to show what you ate today and tomorrow, but think about it more like an instinctive thing. And then think about maybe how photographs might pair together. What kind of themes are you finding from them? Again, this is something you do after the fact. You don't have to think too hard about this when you're photographing. Don't try to force this together. Don't try to force like, oh, I took a photograph of this yesterday, it should fit the next one tomorrow. The fun is just to go through photographing, have a visual diary, and then reflect back. In this case, putting two different photographs together creates a stronger narrative of something that I'm trying to say for myself. I'm not going to explain it. You can interpret it, but there are things I'm playing with themes of food, of themes of family, of sitting together, and all this stuff in this. Again, when you start looking at your photographs, you might find commonalities in perspective and lighting, and together that might be even more provocative as a dual, as a diptych. Again, just using everyday spaces and places around very banal things. Another way to look through, your archive, your kind of project, is to print them on 4x6s. And it's something I do a lot. It's fun to just, photograph them, print them, and then rearrange them. You can rearrange them on their table, put them on the wall. It's great with Explorer, and it's great for someone that's likes more tactile and not be spending too much time on the computer. That's something I like to do. So this is a very specific kind of play on a project. Can anyone tell what's different about this photograph or these images right now on the table? There's something odd about this photo. Baby photos got PSED'd on the second floor window. Concert faces the window, exactly. No, you got it. So you'll see that on the top right window, there's actually a baby that's really large in proportion to the house. So Jia Yi is very close. It's not Photoshop. What I actually did was I started to cut these photographs open and created this kind of photo book. So I started to play kind of the physical form. I just glued these 4x6s back to back. I would cut them out, and I have a staple here to make them kind of a little book. And again, this is not for anyone to see. It's for my own kind of exploration and play, to see the relationship between my photographs. And it's kind of fun exercise, I think. If you have all these pretty photographs, you can kind of explore on your own too. You can see I've kind of created a bigger cutout here. You can see layering here. So it is photoshopping, but it's like a physical Photoshop. I've been taking the photos I've cut out and I've glued them back on the front, just to kind of play with more ideas and themes of the world that I'm experiencing. That also gives you a tour of my house, basically. So it's just a little fun exercise you can do if you have all these photos. Another simple way is just, printing them out on 8.5, 11, and then by 17 sheets. Play with a different scale, fold them together. But in this way, you actually get a book that's in a way never ending. You'll see that I never staple them together. They're just kind of folded and kind of just lightly put together. But that's the point, is that I can add, I can subtract, I can rearrange them however I fit. It's a very much a living archive of a visual diary that I basically have of the space around me. I wish I had a way to do quality color printouts. Yeah, like I think I just went to a local printer for all this. Even the 4x11 or 4x6 prints are just like a local blacks that, if I was like 5 cents a piece, if you do it bulk, it was even cheaper. But this is obviously just for myself. And I think that's the important point of this workshop that I'm going to convey, is that you're making these art about yourself. It's this inward lens in you that you're exploring. And it's ultimately for you to view. For sure, you can share with your family or close ones, but you are your own audience. It's for yourself. It's a diary. For this one, I even created kind of just a red color cover for it, which is just like a red print that I made. But I will add and remove. I'll reflect back. I'll go through this, and it's kind of a fun emotional journey. And as a photographer, I'm terrible at reading or writing, and this is my way of exploring these things that that most people might do through the writing instead. But I think because we have these tools around us, these cameras and these smartphones, I think we can all engage in this kind of exercise. So that's my presentation. I want to thank everyone for being here. And if you haven't gone to Matthew Wong's Blue View exhibition yet, I really encourage you to go. It's up until May 15th. I've already seen it once, but I definitely will go back to see it again because it's that good. And if anyone wants to follow my work or see more about me, just follow me on Instagram. It's Esmond Lee, or my website, esmondlee.com. So I hope you enjoyed this workshop. I went through a lot, but the takeaways are just to have fun. Don't sweat the technique. Use the camera. Print things out. Play with it. And try to speak about beyond the literal world around you and speak for yourself. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for your kind words. Yeah, I'm glad that everyone has lots to think about, and I'm glad you thought it was wonderful. So thank you very much for your time tonight. I'm happy to have shared all this with you. Okay, then. Have a good night, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Friday evening.